If you're a domain name broker or an experienced investor that regularly receives emails from new investors asking for help or valuation, and the portfolio they're sending you is full of trademark domain names, this is the video to refer them to. If you're a new domain investor or speculator, the biggest mistake you can make is discussed in this video, and you better pay attention because it can bankrupt you. This show will tell you why. I have 3 short sponsor messages before we get into today's show. First, if you have a great domain name and nothing to show when people visit, you're missing out on potential advertising revenue, leads, and partnership opportunities. Nichewebsites.com can build you a site quickly with a price option to suit any need. But as their tagline says, they don't just build websites, they build businesses. Second, if you're buying or selling a domain name or a portfolio and you want an estimate of its value, Estabot.com is the place to go. Just like you'd visit Zillow.com to get an estimate of a house value, Estabot.com provides key information about the most important statistics so you can make an informed decision based on data. Finally, DNX.com is a domain name exchange that uses a reverse auction platform to provide fair market prices for quality domain names that are manually filtered by an experienced broker. At DNX.com, domain prices drop until someone decides the price is right. But don't wait too long or the domain you love might be purchased by someone else. All 3 sponsors have a clickable banner in the upper right-hand corner of DomainSherpa.com. Here's your program. Hey everyone, my name is Michael Seiger and I'm the publisher of DomainSherpa.com, the website where you come to learn how to become a successful domain name investor and entrepreneur directly from the experts. Every day, new domain investors and speculators make a mistake that could cost them more than $100,000 simply by registering a $10 domain name. And I'm amazed, but it continues to happen every day and at an increasing rate with the new top-level domains available for registration. Today, we're joined by past Sherpa David Westlow, who is a partner and attorney with Wiley Ryan. David specializes in domain name and intellectual property law. David, welcome back to the show.
Hi, Michael. Thanks for having me back on.
It's great to have you. I want to start off by saying that this is not legal advice. While David and I are discussing a very important legal issue, this is general information only. And if you are a domain name investor and you're faced with one of the issues that we're going to discuss today, consult an attorney for your specific issue and advice. All right, David, first question for you. Let's get a definition of terms. What does it mean to register a trademark domain name?
So strictly speaking, that refers to the registration of a domain name that is identical to or confusingly similar to someone else's trademark.
Okay, that sounds pretty simple to understand. So it's and is that against the law to do, or is it frowned upon, or how do you define that?
Right. So there are really 2 primary legal claims or issues to be concerned with in registration of domain names. One is cyber squatting. The second is trademark infringement. So in relation to cyber squatting, and that would cover things like a UDRP or the new URS for new GTLDs or a cyber squatting lawsuit, those claims relate to whether or not the person or company registering the domain name has a bad faith intent when they register the domain name. Now, that's a little bit different from a trademark infringement claim where the intent is less significant and the court or administrative body would look at whether the use of the domain name is likely to cause consumer confusion. I think for today's show, we'll focus on cyber squatting, and there it's important to keep in mind the big issue is what is the intent of the registrant at the time of registering that domain name.
Okay, and so the intent means that I'm going to register a domain name like, let's say, Oracle, the big software company. If I'm going to register oracle.guru and I want to sell it back to Oracle, that's my intent. That is against the law, and Oracle can file an anti-cyber squatting lawsuit against me for trying to do that.
That's right. So that in that hypothetical, your intent would likely be viewed by a court as being bad faith intent to profit from the trademark significance of that domain name. So in your mind, at the point in time you registered the domain name, you were thinking, well, I'm aware of this trademark. I'm going to register the domain name and sell it to them, presumably at a profit, not for the hand registration fee. So that would be a classic case of cyber squatting that would likely be viewed as violating both the UDRP, the URS, if this was a new GTLD, and then also potentially could subject you to a lawsuit under the Anti-Cyber Squatting Consumer Protection Act, as you mentioned.
Got it. So clear intent to register a trademark that is already registered by a company with bad faith to profit from that domain name. That's what we're talking about here. And what's the big deal about registering a domain name? Like, what's the worst that can happen to someone if they do register a domain name with a trademarked company name, trademarked product, service, or let's say a sports team?
Right. So taking the possibilities in terms of the escalating consequences, if this is a new GTLD domain such as .guru that you mentioned, all new GTLDs are subject to the URS. So that's the Uniform Rapid Suspension Procedure. The result of that procedure would be the domain name would be suspended for the term of the registration, meaning it would not function. The domain name could also be subject to the UDRP, which is the Uniform Domain Name Dispute Resolution Procedure. If a case under the UDRP was successful, the domain name could be transferred to the claimant or canceled. That was a practical matter. The typical result is a transfer of the domain name. You could also be subject to a lawsuit in the United States. The law is the Anti-Cyber Squatting Consumer Protection Act, or the ACPA. Under the ACPA, registration of a domain name in violation of the act can be subject to up to $100,000 per domain name in statutory damages, also attorney's fees, and also a transfer of the domain name. So the consequences can be significant.
So if I go out and I'm thinking, all these new top-level domains are my new gold rush, I'm going to go register google.guru because I know how Google works, and I'm going to talk about it on the website, or I'm going to sell it to somebody. I know everybody loves beer, so I'm going to go register Budweiser.app, and I'm sure somebody will create an app for it, or maybe Budweiser will want to buy it from me. And I'm going to register Seahawks.sports because the Seahawks just won the Super Bowl, and they are the number one team. They're going to dominate for the next few years. I can actually have multiple ACPA lawsuits filed against me. I could lose a lawsuit, have to pay up to $300,000 or $100,000 per each one of those if they wanted to take me to court, and I could have to pay their attorney's fees on top of it.
Yeah, that's right. So, and what's important to keep in mind in each of those cases you mentioned, it was clear that in your mind, your intent when registering the domain name was to trade on or to profit from the trademark significance of the domain name. So that it may be a different outcome if you've never heard of the trademark. Maybe you didn't know that the Seahawks, you're in a different country and somehow you didn't realize they just won the Super Bowl. Now, in a court case, you could potentially be deposed. You could be potentially required to come into court. So, it's important to keep in mind that what's in your mind at the time you register the domain name may actually come out. And if so, yes, you could be subject to all of those things you just mentioned.
Yeah, and it could come out because I could be forced into the deposition, which means that I need to go someplace and swear under testimony, under perjury, that what I'm about to say is what was my intent when I registered the domain name.
That's right. So obviously in a UDRP proceeding or a URS proceeding, there's no live testimony, there's no depositions, there's no actual trial. So in those proceedings, the panelist is looking for indicators of what your intent was. Mm-hmm. So often they'll look at, well, what did you put up on the website? Was it possible that anyone on the face of the earth didn't know that the Seahawks just won the Super Bowl? Things like that. And while you might not be hauled into court and forced to testify under oath in a UDRP proceeding, the same action that violates the UDRP can potentially violate the ACPA under US federal law, which could result in you being pulled into court and being forced to give that sworn testimony about what you were thinking when you registered that domain name.
That makes sense. And if I lose a URS or a UDRP case, that becomes public information such that if I continue to do this, they're going to look at past decisions that have involved me as sort of a, an MO, a modus operandi of the way I operate my domain name investing business, potentially.
Yeah, that's right. So both under the UDRP, we haven't seen the URS is just getting started, but presumably the same principle will apply, that if you've been found to have violated the UDRP, that is evidence in a subsequent proceeding of your bad faith intent in relation to a separate domain name. In relation to the ACPA, the federal law actually states that a history of trafficking in domain names that violate trademarks, in essence, is also evidence of bad faith intent under that law.
Okay. All right. So now we know cut and dry what the definition is. We know black and white what the issue is and what the consequences can be. Now, the Digital Media Law Project, so I want to look at the gray area in between, David. The Digital Media Law Project says, quote, courts have consistently protected the public's right to use the trademarks of others in order to engage in criticism, commentary, news reporting, and other forms of non-commercial expression, end quote. So if I register a domain name and I have good faith intent to create a website in one of those areas, do I have to worry about registering the domain name if it includes a trademark?
Yeah, and again, it's important to distinguish the legal risks or the potential claims between a cyber squatting claim, which again relates to what was your intent at the time of registration or use of the domain name, and the potential other claim of trademark infringement, which would relate not to the act of registering or trafficking in the domain name, but in how you use it. So first, if we talk about cyber squatting, so that in relation to the UDRP and the ACPA federal claim, the first issue would be in the situation you mentioned was the intention to use the domain name in a non-commercial manner? And then was the domain name actually used in a non-commercial manner? So for a criticism site, is the site actually non-commercial and used to express real criticism of the trademark owner, or is the criticism secondary to the registrant's intent to make money from the domain name? And that is an important issue both when dealing with criticism sites and with fan sites. Now, if the domain use is truly non-commercial, so again, in relation to cyber squatting, what was your intent? And if your intent, ultimately, if you were under oath and asked what were you thinking at the time of registration, and your intent, your response under oath would be, well, I had a bad experience with that particular company. I wanted to express what happened. No, I had no intention of putting up ads or selling the domain name to them or monetizing the site in some other manner. Then that may well be a non-commercial use that could qualify as either being exempt from the UDRP or the ACPA. Now, if you overcome that hurdle of your intent and your use is truly non-commercial, it also depends on the domain name. Some UDRP panelists have found that the domain name itself must express that criticism. The classic example would be adding sucks to the trademark. Some panelists have said, well, if you've done that and your intent, you've used the site in a non-commercial manner, it's not subject to the UDRP. But there's really a split there. Other panelists have said that, well, the domain name may yet be subject to the UDRP based on the other factors. So it is a bit of a gray area. Under US federal law, assuming the use is truly non-commercial and there is critical content of the trademark owner, it's less likely to be found to have violated the ACPA, so less likely to be cyber squatting. There may yet be a trademark infringement claim, that's going to relate to, is there a likelihood of consumer confusion raised based on how the site is structured, how it looks? Will people think there's an affiliation? Now, if it's a criticism site and it's legitimate criticism, probably not, because most people wouldn't think that someone that is saying not favorable things about a company has some relationship to the company. But if it's, light criticism coupled with ads, it could actually be a cyber squatting issue.
Yeah. All right. So if somebody, when .sports becomes available, if somebody goes out with the intent of building a fan blog on Seattle Mariners.sports, or maybe Mariners.sports, or, something with a team name in it, that requires all the conditions that we just talked about. It needs to be non-commercial. It needs to have some sort of. It needs to state that it's not affiliated with the official organization.
Right. So if the true intent, again, if you were ultimately, worst case scenario, pulled into court and you're under oath and your true intent was not to monetize the domain name, but just to talk about what a rabid fan you are of whatever team that is, then that is unlikely to be bad faith intent under the Cyber Squatting Act. It may still be trademark infringement because the way you use the trademark may be found to have caused a likelihood of consumer confusion. People may think that you're sponsored by the team, or that there's some affiliation or some relationship. So that could be trademark infringement, even though it's not cyber squatting.
Gotcha. But if I registered baseball.sports and I love the Mariners more than everybody else, and I featured them more than anybody else in my commentary, but I also talked about other, baseball teams as well, I would be fine to sell advertising on that domain because it's not a domain name that uses a trademark. Is that correct?
That's right. So at the outset, you asked what was the definition of registering a domain name with a trademark? And we said it was where the domain name was identical to or confusingly similar to someone else's trademark. So there, baseball.sports, that's not like that. It couldn't be a trademark when used in relation to baseball information. Now, if someone uses baseball for recipes or something that's not baseball related, then there's possible that there's a trademark for baseball in some other, as related to some other field. That's called an arbitrary use of the word, which would be an arbitrary trademark. But that's not the example you gave. You're talking about using the word for its generic connotation. So that domain name should not be subject to UDRP or other type of cyber squatting claim.
Right. Okay. And if somebody, gets really excited, registers a bunch of sports teams or company names and all these new top level domains, and, then they start to get cease and desist letters, or companies just pass right through that option and go directly to a URS and suspend the domain names, or a UDRP, and get the domain names taken away, or the ACPA lawsuit, the cyber squatting lawsuit. What is that individual risking?
Worst case scenario, up to $100,000 in statutory damages per domain name plus attorney's fees. It really depends on who the trademark owner is, whether they'll take that step, but that clearly is a risk that could happen. As we talked about, if there are trademark names within someone's portfolio, then that also can cause problems for other names. If in one proceeding, evidence that the same registrant owns other domains that incorporate other companies' trademarks, can be evidence of cyber squatting, both under the UDRP and the ACPA.
And, this isn't a show to recommend how people should structure their domain investing business, but if there is a newer investor that hasn't formed a legal entity to protect their personal assets and they get hit with a $100,000 lawsuit, that could potentially bankrupt them. That could take away everything they have. That could, create a financial situation for them and their family that, is going to be hard to come back from.
Yeah, that's right. And one thing that not a lot of people realize is under trademark and other types of intellectual property law, even if there's a corporate structure in place, sometimes think that the corporate structure will insulate the people involved in the company. So if you have an LLC, they think, well, I can't be held personally liable. If you as an individual are actively involved in whatever the act of intellectual property infringement was, whether that's cyber squatting or trademark infringement or copyright infringement, many courts say that you can be held liable individually apart from that corporate structure. Mm-hmm. So in this context, even if you have an LLC, that's not necessarily going to protect you from that worst case scenario that you mentioned.
Great question, or great point that you bring up there, David. Let me ask you about CCTLDs, country code top-level domains. I think people in countries other than the United States may not be aware of trademarks of large companies in the United States, or they may not be aware that or they may be aware that, a lawsuit in the United States can't reach over to other countries. A personal example from Domain Sherpa, I noticed 2 days ago, domainsherpa.in, the country code TLD for India, was registered, domainsherpa.in. And right now, the owner, or the registrant, that appears to be K. Rajagopalan, Rajagopalan, has registered it. It is parked. It is displaying advertising, and it has a banner across the top that says "for purchase or lease." I own the trademark for Domain Sherpa. It's clear what Domain Sherpa does. We have reach across the entire world. We have readership in every country. What could happen to this person that has registered domainsherpa.in, and are they allowed to do it just because they're in another country?
Right. So country code registries do not necessarily follow the UDRP. However, out of the 252 country codes, I'd say the vast majority have a UDRP-like policy that's very often almost identical. And what's interesting is a lot of country codes adopted the UDRP, but did make one change, and that is in the first element of the third element of the UDRP, that the registrant must have registered and used the domain name in bad faith. Under country code policies, that is often changed to or. The practical implication is that it's actually easier in a lot of cases to win a UDRP under a country code policy than it is under a generic top-level domain using the UDRP. So in this case, it sounds like the registrant has a real issue under the UDRP, and that you as the trademark owner could likely pursue a claim under that country code policy. The registrant could also have liability under other laws. We've talked about the U.S. Anti-Cyber Squatting Consumer Protection Act and the U.S. Federal Trademark Act. There are similar laws in other countries. So they could also have the risk that you could pursue a legal claim through the local courts.
Okay. So, I don't know who this person is. I hope they watch this show and that they realize that they made a mistake and they either drop the domain name or transfer it over to me or something, because it's upsetting to me, and I'm sure it's upsetting to, hundreds of thousands of other business owners that face the exact same situation where a new investor comes in and think that they can profit off of something that has, built up brand equity and value in the marketplace. And so, but ignorance is no excuse for making this mistake. Is that correct, David? Can this person respond to a UDRP and say, I didn't know it was a trademark, I'm sorry?
They certainly could, and we see that in the context of the UDRP, because again, there's no sworn testimony, there's no in-person hearing, it's all on paper, and oftentimes they're defended by the registrant saying, I just had never heard of the trademark owner. It often comes down to, in UDRP cases, what does the paper trail show? So how was the domain name used? In this case, there are ads that I think are specifically tailored to your site. So it would appear that they've structured the website that they put up to gain compensation based on people clicking and thinking that there's some relation to your site. So In the UDRP context, that would be evidence that they, actually were aware of your show, of your trademark. It's hard to say how it might come out, if they provided some evidence that said they did not have bad faith intent. But here, the paper trail would seem to suggest they knew what they're doing, and the UDRP panelists might be disinclined to believe them, that they'd never heard of you when the way they use the site suggests otherwise.
Yeah, so they can just lie and claim ignorance, but they might still lose. And if they're upfront and truthful about it, then they're definitely going to lose. Either way, ignorance isn't necessarily a way out and a way to keep the domain name and a way to profit from it.
Yeah, that's right. And I would say, in those cases where the response to a UDRP complaint is something that's less than forthright, very often that forces the claimant to consider, should we just take this to court? If, does this mean that we're not going to get the result that we want out of this proceeding, and do we just need to go to court because it's less likely that someone could be dishonest in court? We can reach the same result, which would be a transfer. The domain name, we could potentially get something more, including a monetary award and attorney's fees. So that, sometimes I think people don't realize that by trying to avoid the results of the UDRP proceeding, they actually are forcing the claimant to consider their court options.
All right, so let's assume that most people in the world are of good faith. They want to register good faith domains. They want to stay on the right side of the law. How can they, during the registration process, as they're trying to think of great domain names to register that might have value to other companies in the future, how can someone, not be ignorant when they're registering domain names that might include trademarks?
Right. So all trademarks are categorized on what's called a spectrum of distinctiveness. On the one end, there are coined words. These are words that don't exist in the English language. Something like Verizon. There's really never going to be a good reason to register a domain name that incorporates a coined word. It's going to be very hard to establish you had good faith intent when registering that type of trademark. Moving down the spectrum are arbitrary trademarks. So that's where the word exists in the English language, but if it's used in some arbitrary manner, it can be a valid trademark. Apple is the classic example. So Apple in relation to fruits cannot be a trademark. Apple in relation to computer products or digital media obviously is a very strong trademark. If you're registering words that you might think are generic, under trademark law, it really depends on what's the connotation, how is it being used. Under trademark law, it's not generic and therefore exempt from trademark protection unless you consider the use. So a generic word from a trademark sense is where the word is being used as the name of what's the genus of the goods or the services. So if you're registering those types of words, it's always a possibility there may be a trademark. Great idea to do a trademark search. Make sure you're not running into someone who's using that word in the arbitrary sense that has given them trademark rights.
Gotcha. So if I register apple.info and I may have good faith intent to have, apple orchards or things like that, that might be fine. But if I'm registering computers.com or .biz, or I'm registering hdtv.com, that is clearly a domain name that associates with computers and Apple's Apple Computers trademark.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, perfect. Now, what if I look through my portfolio today, David, and I am, now that I've watched this show and I'm educated, and I think, hey, these domains might be problematic. What should I do? What do you think should be the next step?
Yeah, it's hard. I'd say take a close look at them, look at how you've been using them, revisit what you were thinking when you registered them, because again, that's for cyber squatting, for UDRP, URS, or ACPA. The claim really is, well, what was your intent when you registered them? So try and think back, how did they come into your portfolio and what was your intent? And then how are you using them now? there are UDRP panel decisions that have found that willful blindness of a trademark does not exempt you from the UDRP. Now, that most frequently comes up in the case of automated registration using something like a drop catching service to register names. There are UDRP panelists that will say, well, you should have searched for trademarks. And if you used an automated service, then you were willfully or knowingly blind to the trademarks. So then the name can be subject to a UDRP. Now, the decisions have gone both ways on that point, but there is a potential risk there.
What tools can people use if they want to go search for a trademark, David?
Trademark 24/7 is a great service, easy to use. Trademark247.com. You can also go directly to the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. That's uspto.gov. The interface is slightly less intuitive, but it's there. That's the master source of U.S. trademarks. Nearly all national governments have their own trademark database that's online as well. The European Union, there's a single trademark registration that covers all of the European Union. The abbreviation for that agency is OHIM, OHIM. If you do a search for it, you'll find that. It's a great idea to check for European community trademarks as well. Wherever you're located in the world, your country likely has an online database of trademarks. It's a great idea to check there as well.
All right. And if people have questions and they want to, speak to an attorney, I know that you both work on a retainer and probably an hourly rate. How can people contact you, David, if they want to, discuss their personal situation?
I'm reachable, of course, at davidweslow.com or Twitter at davidweslow. I'm happy to chat with anyone. I know you've also had some other great attorneys on your show as well they could reach out to, or if they have a attorney they regularly work with. I think it's a great idea if they're about to register a name, or now in relation to new GTLDs, there are claims notices that at least for the first 90 days of new GTLDs, if you're about to register a name and you see a claims notice, which means that domain name may conflict with someone else's trademark, it's a great idea to talk to an attorney and get a handle on whether or not you really should proceed with that registration.
But just because you don't see that notice when you're registering a new top-level domain like .guru or something doesn't mean that it's clear to register, does it, David?
No, that's right. And it's important to keep in mind, claims notices are generated for trademarks that are registered in ICANN's trademark clearinghouse, which I think as of last month, there was under 30,000 trademarks in the clearinghouse. You compare that to the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office registers about 200,000 trademarks per year. That shows that it really is a small fraction of trademarks that are in the clearinghouse and that are going to generate claims notices. And then the claims notices are only mandatory for 90 days. So it's a great point. If you don't receive a claims notice, it doesn't mean it's clear. If you do receive a claims notice, it's worth pausing and doing some deliberative thinking about whether or not you should go forward.
All right. David Weslow, partner and attorney with Wiley Ryan. Thank you for coming on the show, explaining trademark law as it relates to domain names. Thanks for preventing others from making the mistake that so many in the past have made. And thanks for being a return domain Sherpa.
Thanks for having me on again, Michael.
Thank you all for watching. We'll see you next time.